Did you know that a mother once cut off her own daughter's curly hair, not as punishment, but to make things equal? A sibling had straight hair, so the curls had to go. Welcome to Whispering Pages. If you're here just for the summary, skip to the next chapter. For the rest of us, let's ease in. Let the weight of the day belong to today. Tonight belongs to something quieter. The brain at this hour absorbs differently. What you hear now tends to stay. Tonight we're into Siblings Without Rivalry by Adele, Faber and Elaine Mazlish, published in 1987. It became a New York Times bestseller and remains one of the most practical books ever written on raising children who actually like each other. So let's begin. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let's whisper through this one together. There's a moment that Adele, Faber and Elaine Mazlish describe early in the book that cuts right to the heart of why they wrote it. They were leading a workshop on sibling rivalry, and they asked the group to think back to their own childhoods. What had their parents done that made the competition worse? What had actually helped? Within minutes, the room was flooded with old memories. A man in his 40s described how his father had compared him to his brother every day of his life, and how those comparisons still drove him in ways he couldn't entirely control. He had to be in charge. He couldn't take an excellent offer to sell his business and stay on to manage it, because managing wasn't owning. He had to be the boss, even now. He traced it directly back to being the oldest brother. Another man described how he was the youngest of 5 brothers, all high achievers. They used to call him the adopted one, affectionately, because he was always upstairs grinding away at the books while they were having fun. "My wife calls me a workaholic," he said quietly. "What she doesn't understand is that part of me is still running like hell to keep up with my brothers." A woman couldn't receive a compliment without immediately thinking of her older sister, who described herself at 13 as gorgeous, glamorous, and glorious, while labeling her kid sister sweet, simple, sincere. These weren't children speaking. These were grown adults, some in their 50s and 60s, still carrying the weight of their sibling relationships. That was the moment the authors understood the full weight of what they were exploring. Adele, Faber and Elaine Mazlish trained under the late child psychologist Chaim Ginott, who is something of a patron saint of the communication-based approach to parenting. His central belief, that children's feelings matter and must be acknowledged before behavior can shift, runs through everything in this book. After years of running parent workshops, speaking nationwide, and interviewing hundreds of people about their sibling experiences, they wrote Siblings Without Rivalry in 1987. It became an immediate bestseller. The book's central argument is this: sibling rivalry is not inevitable. It can be reduced, sometimes dramatically, by how parents respond. Not by forcing peace, not by demanding that children love each other, but by understanding the emotional roots of the conflict and gently changing the conditions that feed it. At the heart of all sibling conflict, they argue, is each child's deep need for the exclusive love of their parents. When another child appears in the family, it signals potential loss. Less time, less attention, less of everything that matters. The child thinks, unconsciously, if my parents are pouring all that love and enthusiasm into my brother or sister, maybe that sibling is worth more than me. And if they're worth more, that must mean I'm worth less. And if I'm worth less, I'm in serious trouble. No wonder children struggle so fiercely to be first. No wonder they want more of everything, more of the toys, more of the food, more of the space. Security, in the child's mind, lies in having all of mommy, all of daddy, all of it. The authors had a realistic goal for themselves and for the parents in their workshops. Not to make siblings best friends. That was the dream that kept people on an emotional roller coaster, elated every time the children played nicely, despairing every time they fought. The better goal was to equip children with the attitudes and skills they'd need for all caring relationships. How to listen. How to respect differences. How to find their way through disagreement. Even if two siblings never become close, they can still learn how to make a friend and be a friend. That is a different kind of peace, but it lasts. The book opens with a workshop exercise that many parents find quietly devastating. The authors ask the group to imagine that their spouse has just introduced a new person into the family. A second spouse. The spouse explains warmly that they love them so much that they've decided to bring in someone else to share in all of it. As the exercise unfolds, more details are added. The new spouse is young and cute. When the three of you go out together, strangers fawn over the newcomer and barely acknowledge you. Your husband goes into your closet and gives some of your clothes to her because yours don't fit you anymore. One afternoon you're struggling to figure out a new device and she bursts in saying, "Can I use it? I know how." When you say no, she cries to your husband, and he comes back with his arm around her, saying, "What would be the harm in letting her have a turn? Why can't you share?" When the authors ask the group what they are feeling, the answers pour out. Furious. Humiliated. Replaced. Desperate to get the newcomer into trouble. To hurt her. To diminish her in their partner's eyes. The group laughs at themselves, but uncomfortably, because they've just understood something. The jealousy their children feel is not irrational. It is exactly what they themselves would feel. Then the authors ask, what would your partner need to do for you to feel better? The answers are revealing. Not get rid of her, because even in the fantasy, people admitted that would feel precarious. What people wanted was to be heard. To say terrible things about the new wife without being corrected, without being told to be reasonable. To have someone genuinely listen, not glancing at the clock, not turning on the television, not rushing to defend the newcomer. One woman says it perfectly, "The main thing for me would be to know that he really understood how I felt." This is the book's first and perhaps most important insight. The worst thing a parent can do in response to a child's jealousy is deny it. Saying you shouldn't feel that way, or of course I love you equally, or stop being so silly doesn't reassure a child. It teaches them that their inner world is wrong. And that lesson, that your feelings are not to be trusted, that they are embarrassing, that they make you difficult, has a very long reach. What works instead is acknowledgement. One image that stays with readers is this: love isn't like a pie, where more for one means less for another. When a new child enters a family, a parent doesn't divide their love, they expand it. And for each child, that love is specific. It belongs to them. It has always belonged to them. The book also addresses one temptation that many parents fall into, trying to suppress the rivalry altogether. In families where children are told they must love each other, where negative feelings are treated as shameful, the hostility doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It emerges sideways, in cruelty, in withdrawal, in a chill that persists through adulthood. One man in the group describes a family where fighting simply wasn't permitted. Not even anger was allowed. "A lot of my angry feelings got squished down," he says, "because I was afraid of what would happen if they ever came out." 30 years later, the feelings were still there. The authors draw throughout the book on psychologist Dorothy Baruch's observation, "Not till the bad feelings come out can the good ones come in." Allowing a child to express genuine anger toward a sibling, in words, not in hitting, actually tends to reduce conflict over time, not escalate it. The feeling, once spoken and heard, loses some of its power. What festers is not the expressed emotion. It's the one no one was allowed to name. One of the most vivid sections in the book is about comparisons. The authors asked their workshop group to respond to a series of statements as if they were children being compared to a sibling. Statements like, "Why can't you clean your room like your brother?" Or, a version meant to be kind, "You're so much more athletic than your sister." Or the motivational variety that parents often don't think of as comparison at all. Alex gets right down to his homework without anyone having to nag him. The responses come fast and raw. "I hate him." "I'll never be what you want." "You don't love me for me." And one that stops the room, "If I can't be best at being good, I'll be best at being bad." The authors take this seriously, because some children do exactly that. They look at the child who receives the praise, decide they can never compete on that ground, and plant their flag somewhere else entirely. Often somewhere that worries everyone. One woman in the group describes how her mother had held Dorothy up as the model for years. She had moved 1,000 miles away to recover. "Even now I dread the holidays. My mother starts right in. Your hair's looking a little dull. Maybe you ought to get it touched up, like Dorothy. That sister of yours is a real go-getter. It takes me weeks to recover from those visits." A man describes how his father's comparisons between his two older brothers never stopped, even though both are now in their 40s and both on dialysis. They compete over which of them is sicker, which treatment is more correct. "Grown men," he says grimly. Favorable comparisons, the authors point out, are just as damaging as unfavorable ones. One woman describes how being praised as more orderly than Dorothy made her feel wonderful for a moment, and then anxious. Could she keep it up? And what would happen if Dorothy became orderly? Where would that leave her? It took a year of therapy to realize she was still doing to herself as an adult what her mother had done to her as a child, constantly measuring everything about herself against other people. "Never compare yourself to others," her therapist told her. "You'll become either vain or bitter." The parents in the workshop also discover that even well-intentioned praise of one child, offered in front of the other, lands as comparison. When a parent enthusiastically tells a friend about something one child did brilliantly, the sibling standing within earshot automatically hears the subtext, "And you didn't." The author's advice is to save your most enthusiastic praise for the ear of the child who earned it, when it's just the two of you. Let the moment belong only to them. The antidote to comparison is description. Instead of "Why can't you be on time like your brother?" try "You're late." When you're late, it makes things harder for everyone. Talk about this child, this behavior, this moment. Leave the sibling out of it entirely. The goal is to address behavior without turning it into a ranking, because rankings don't teach anything except where you stand relative to someone else. The chapter on equal treatment is one of the book's most liberating. The authors share stories from parents trying desperately to be fair, stories that slide from touching into absurd. One mother threw potfuls of ice at her children during a summer cleanup game, trying to equalize shares, until all three were ankle deep and still screaming for more. Another mother chose not to nurse her second daughter because her first had been bottle-fed, and she didn't want any inequity. A parent, rushing to give both children equal time, bought socks for one child and felt compelled to buy identical socks for the other even though she didn't need them. The author's conclusion is clarifying. Children don't actually want equal. They want to feel uniquely valued. When a child demands the same thing their sibling has, what they're really asking is, do I matter to you? Am I seen as myself? The answer doesn't come from counting grapes. It comes from attention that is specific, from a parent who says, in whatever form fits the moment, you are the only you in the whole wide world. No one could ever take your place. That sentence is not about fairness. It's about identity. And it does what equal treatment never can. Children are natural categorizers. Put two siblings in a room for long enough and they will begin to sort themselves out. One becomes the brave one. The other becomes the careful one. One becomes the funny one. The other becomes the serious one. It makes a kind of sense. If you claim different territory, there's less to compete over. The trouble is that these identities, once established, become very hard to escape. A child labeled the difficult one begins to see that label as a fact about themselves. A child labeled the responsible one feels the pressure of that expectation and loses the freedom to be ordinary, to be young, to make mistakes without confirming a story that was never really true. One father in the book describes how he always praised Michael as the big boy and let the baby just be the baby. When he and his partner finally dropped the labels entirely and called their children by their names rather than their roles, Michael climbed into his father's lap, announced he was Super Baby, and waited, delighted, to see how his father would react. "Hi, Super Baby," his father said simply. The boy beamed. It was the first time he'd been allowed to just be small. The fix is not to pretend children don't have distinct personalities. They do. The fix is to widen the lens. When the child who has always been the disorganized one surprises you by tidying the pantry while you were out, you don't say, "I had no idea you could do that." You say, "You tackled that entire mess and found a place for everything." That's real resourcefulness. You describe what you see. You don't contradict the old story, you just stop telling it. And something shifts. When siblings label each other, "She's always like that, he never does anything right," a parent can gently intervene. Not to scold, but to offer a different frame. One mother in the book, whose sons were locked into the roles of bully and weakling, tries something small. She says to the supposed weakling, "It's a good thing you're tough enough to take it." Both boys look amazed. For the first time, neither is playing his assigned part. The fighting chapter is where many parents arrive first when they pick up this book, and it earns its place. The authors begin by asking when a parent should intervene in a sibling fight, and when to stay out. The answer is, stay out when you can. Children who argue and bicker are doing something useful, learning to assert themselves, to tolerate frustration, to negotiate. These are skills they will use their whole lives. But when the fight escalates into real danger, when someone is being physically hurt, when the screaming has gone on for a long time, when it keeps happening around the same issue, a parent does need to step in. And how they step in matters enormously. The standard approach is most parents default to tend to make things worse. Taking sides. Punishing both equally without investigating. Demanding an apology while both children are still furious. These responses feel fair. They often create more resentment than they resolve. What the authors recommend instead is a 5-step approach that begins with acknowledging the feelings of both children before doing anything else. "I can see you're both really angry right now." Then listen to each side, with genuine attention. Show that you understand the difficulty of the problem. Then, and this is the part that surprises people, express confidence that the children can work it out themselves, and leave the room. It sounds naively optimistic. But what the workshop participants consistently discovered was that children, when trusted to find solutions, often found them. A 6-year-old worked out a plan to divide acorns fairly in the car, not equal, but fair, through a chain of small trades that left no one cheated. 2 5-year-olds, told by an adult that she had confidence in them, figured out that both could be Spider-Man at once. A father who compared his daughter's problem to the challenge of writing the United States Constitution, pointing out that it took the wisest men from 13 different states not days but years to agree, found that his daughters stopped demanding he solve it and began talking seriously to each other for the first time. The book's final chapter holds some of its most moving material. It's a follow-up session, held a month after the workshops ended. Not everyone came back, but the ones who did had things to say. One woman had called her estranged sister, Dorothy. Their mother had spent decades holding Dorothy up as the model. Beautiful, accomplished, effortlessly superior. This woman had spent most of her adult life quietly resenting both her mother and her sister. But something she'd heard in the workshop about the burden of being the good child had stayed with her. She started to wonder, for the first time, whether Dorothy had suffered too. When she called, she found out she was right. Dorothy had felt the pressure of the role. Had worried that becoming close to her sister would somehow disappoint their mother, who needed Dorothy to be the special one. They talked for a long time. They cried. They made plans to meet, just the two of them, no husbands, no children, to finally get to know each other. At nearly 50 years old. Another participant in that final session was the woman whose sister had emotional problems throughout their shared childhood. Her parents had always been consumed by her sister's needs. The well child had been expected to be perfect, dependable, the one they could count on. She had spent the workshop's final weeks working up the courage to tell her mother what that had actually been like. She finally did. I said, "You were so obsessed with Lynn and her problems that you never saw me. You never knew who I was and never cared to know. So I never really felt loved." Her mother denied it at first, then listened. And then something happened that the daughter hadn't expected. Her mother sat very still and said, "I had no idea. I don't know what to say." And the woman told her, "Nothing. I just wanted you to know." Then she put her arms around her mother. I felt as if a wall had come down between us. This is the quiet promise at the center of the book. Not that you can engineer perfect relationships between your children. You can't. But you can reduce the conditions that make genuine connection impossible. You can stop placing them in competition. You can let them have their feelings without demanding they perform love they don't feel. And in doing so, you give them a better chance of finding their way to each other, not because you told them to, but because there was room. The honest critique of the book is this: it was written in the 1980s, and some of its scenarios feel of that era. The workshop format, the earnest group discussions, the faith in communication as a solution to most family dynamics, some readers find this dated. The book also doesn't address blended families or single-parent households in much depth. And it assumes a level of parental emotional availability that isn't always realistic at the end of a hard day. For further depth, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk by the same authors fills in the broader emotional language tools that underpin everything here, particularly for parents who want more on responding when children are upset. If you want to understand the science behind sibling dynamics more deeply, The Sibling Bond by Stephen Bank and Michael Kahn goes further into birth order, long-term identity, and what shapes the sibling relationship over a lifetime. There's much more in the full book, including detailed real-life scripts for specific fight scenarios, chapters on children with disabilities and the particular strains that creates for their siblings, and a complete final session on making peace with your own sibling history as an adult that deserves your attention. The link to grab a copy is below, and it helps support the channel at no extra cost to you. Take that with you tonight. The child who insists they're being treated unfairly isn't asking for a recount. They're asking to be seen. Sleep well. And we'll see you at Whispering Pages for the next one.